The Shambles, the beating, bleeding heart of York. The real city, the working city, the city of blood, sweat and desire. This is the meat district, and it never lets you forget it. Carcasses hang from hooks above your head. Blood pools in the gutters. The smell clings to your clothes long after you leave. No hygiene laws, no refrigeration, no pretense. And yet, by the time this meat reaches the tables of the wealthy, it is transformed, roasted, glazed, garnished, made beautiful. The rich will never see it like this. They never see the rawness, the labour, the mess. They only see the finished dish, carried in by servants, dressed to hide what they once were. And that is the first truth of the Shambles. The city hides the origins of the things it consumes. But down here, nothing is hidden, and nothing sees more than a butcher's dog. You find them everywhere, sitting just out of reach, eyes fixed on the hooks, waiting for something to fall. They're trained to obey. They know their place. They wait for the scraps. That is the rule. But the scraps are all they will ever get. If a dog gets too close, if it reaches for something better, it is kicked away. Not out of cruelty, out of fear. Because every butcher knows a hungry dog that stops obeying is dangerous. A dog that takes meat for itself breaks the order of the street. And that is the second truth of the Shambles. Obedience is enforced by fear, and fear runs both ways. And then comes the truth nobody dared say aloud. And when the dogs stop fearing you, they will bite. And you will fear them. And that is the third truth of the Shambles. And so it came to pass, in an isolated corner of Essex, on a farm so remote no one could hear the screams, that the dogs stopped fearing their masters. 5 men entered the home of the widow Shelley. They carried pistols. They threatened to murder her if she didn't reveal her money. They threatened to throw her across the fire. They threatened her son. And when he broke, they took everything they could carry. And the dogs began to feast. And the worst of these dogs was named Turpin, a butcher by trade. This was not just crime. This was the order of England inverted. The poor taking the meat of the rich. The dogs eating from the master's table. And this was a warning carried into Parliament in 1735, when Sir William Wentworth Fitzwilliam stood before the House and read the reports aloud. Pistols, threats, terror in an Essex farmhouse. And then came the line that froze the chamber. A terror with a new name. The Gregory Gang. And the worst among them, a dog named Turpin. A name that would soon be known across the land. Wentworth demanded something radical. A permanent police force to protect property and people in what he saw as increasingly lawless times. He argued that the Black Act and the Bloody Code, hundreds of capital offences, were failing. For a century, the logic had been simple. If we hang them for murder, murder will stop. But murder did not stop. If we hang them for highway robbery will stop. But highway robbery did not stop. Nor did housebreaking, or sheep stealing, or pickpocketing. They needed more protection, he argued. But Parliament rejected him. 18th century Britain did not have a police force. The idea of a standing force to control society seemed a step towards tyranny. Too French. And the one thing they all refused to see was this. These were crimes of poverty. And hanging the poor did not cure poverty. Admitting that would mean admitting they might have to do something about poverty. And that was a truth the Georgians had no appetite for. So they kept adding offences to the Black Act until there were more than 200 ways to send an unfortunate to the gallows. And still, the rich felt that they were the victims. And so they sought to save themselves, to protect what they believed was rightfully theirs. Country living was becoming dangerous, and the wealthy were safer in cities. York saw its opportunity. For centuries, it had been a hub of a land where power lived in glorious isolation on the vast country estates that had been granted by William the Conqueror and inherited generation after generation. The country gent, the country landowner, that was where the power was. But these owners, these barons of those estates, came to York to wield their authority as the Council of the North. And then after a few weeks, they'd return to their lands, to their mansions. But then the city lost the thing that had once made it powerful. The Council of the North was gone. The court no longer visited. The great decisions of the kingdom were made elsewhere. So the corporation, the Lord Mayor, the aldermen, the guilds made a choice. If York couldn't be important politically, it would be important socially. If it couldn't host the court, it would host the wealthy. And if the wealthy were going to live here, York would make sure that they lived well. So the rich retreated into places like York, expecting comfort, safety, and luxury. And one of the first to arrive was Wentworth himself, a man who feared the dogs would come for him next. So he built himself a refuge here in York. He built a house that was worthy of his status. He built a house that reflected the fear that he felt. I'm just going to take a sip of water. After 10 minutes continuous talking. So he built a fortress of comfort, a city house for a country magnate, a lookout post, a place where he could watch society, where, of course, from the shadows, society could watch him. So that house is just around the corner. It is now currently a pub, the House of Trending Madness. So when you look at it, you'll see both the houses, both buildings next door to each other actually formed one building, one house. This was the house of Sir Wentworth Fitzwilliam, famous for building Wentworth Woodhouse near Rotherham, the largest private house in England. This was a man of serious wealth, a man of serious political clout. But it was insufficient to persuade Parliament and the people of the need for protection. Not yet. Not now. But soon. See how that's one sec. Thanks. Oh, just take a breather. So yes, thank you for not sort of chatting a lot during this. I'm trying to do it as sort of continuous, but just get a breather. Give you all a breather. Hope you're enjoying it so far. And then we'll show you Wentworth House and push on with our story. Lovely day here in York. So coming into view then, Wentworth's house. The house that he built himself when they stopped listening to him. He was an influential man, called for a police force. He was ignored. The dangers, Turpin, the Gregory gang, were not enough yet to warrant a response. So at ground level, we see the house of Trembling Madness. Next to it, the old bank. If you look above, you can see it makes much more sense to see it as one property. Get a sense of the scale of Wentworth's house, one of the richest men in England. The grand portico above the old bank pub, again gives us a clue. And this is a central section. One end is actually missing, so it gives you a sense of quite how big this house was. If that door that's down here was once in the middle. And right beside it, of course, we have the Judge's Lodgings, another Georgian mansion, another statement of wealth, another reminder that when the elite retreated into cities, they didn't do it quietly. These houses were the first sign of a city reshaping itself around the people it wanted to attract. If York was going to attract men like Wentworth, if it was going to become a refuge for the elite, then the city was going to need a grand house of its own. A statement, a promise, a declaration of appetite. And by the 1720s, it was clear the city needed a building that matched those ambitions. A residence worthy of entertaining the elite. A place to host, a place to impress, a place to display the city's wealth. And so, in 1730, York built the first purpose-built mansion house in England, Hannah. Not a home, not a statement, a civic palace, a stage for ceremony, a fortress of silver, a declaration that York might have lost political power, but it lost none of its appetite. And of course, once these grand houses existed, they didn't stay empty for long. They needed a filling, and York rushed to feed this appetite. First came the furniture, not simply tables and chairs, but status made solid. Mahogany dining tables, carved chairs, long case clocks, silverware, mirrors, tapestries. York's cabinet makers, upholsterers, clockmakers and jewellers soon had a market like never before. A city of craftsmen living on the endless more of the wealthy. And then came the food, the fine meals, the pastries, game, imported sugar, wines, spices, the same flesh that dripped on the stones of the Shambles, transformed into Georgian feasts. Hunger at one end of the city, indulgence at the other. And then came the people, because a house like this did not run on elegance alone. It ran on labour. Footmen, Maids, cooks, nursemaids, coachmen, scullery girls, errand boys, a whole hidden workforce moved through the back staircases and the service corridors. The unseen hands that kept the appetite satisfied. And once the wealthy had filled their house with everything money could buy, their appetites turned to what money could summon. And the freshest meat of all wasn't on the table, it was a bell's ring away. And whatever rewards a servant might receive, this was never an equal exchange. Power decided everything. In this world, you kissed arse or you bit it. And everyone knew the consequences of choosing the second. Most people kissed, a few bit. And the moment you bit, the city had a name for you: criminal. But their attitude to crime was flexible, convenient, shaped entirely by appetite. Because the appetites of the wealthy didn't just shape their households, they shaped the whole economy around them. These grand Georgian homes needed filling. One of the things they needed the most was meat. More people living in cities meant more mouths to feed, more feasts, more kitchens, more demand. And that demand didn't care really, at the end of the day, where the meat came from. Poaching was a capital crime, punishable by death. But the supply was welcome. Poachers were the original blackfaces that gave the Black Act its name. Sleeping through forests at night, bringing down deer and game that belonged by law to the landowners. And when poachers needed to turn their evidence into something unrecognisable, they went to the one person who could help them: a butcher. And that's how a young lad named Richard Turpin, far from York, born in Essex, apprenticed in London, found himself drawn into crime.
Not far.
Not as a highwayman, not as a legend, just as a butcher who knew how to turn a poacher's kill into joints of meat that cooks in big houses would buy without asking questions. He didn't kiss arse, but he didn't bite it. Not yet. Instead, he learned how to feed their appetite. And as he did, he began to develop an appetite of his own. Which brings us to where we're heading now. Because while Turpin was learning how to survive in the shadows of London and Essex, the machinery that would one day judge him was already built here in York, at a place called the Judge's Court, a house built for the travelling judges. Sorry, let me just not get run over by this Uber. So this is Judge's Court, the residence for the travelling assize judges, men like Sir William Chappell, who arrived in 1739 to preside over the Northern Circuit, staying in comfort, dining in the Mansion House, and dispensing justice under the full weight of the Black Act. More than 200 capital crimes, property valued above life, men, women and children condemned for offences that today wouldn't earn a fine. A world where the wealthy lived in luxury and the poor stood in the dock with everything stacked against them. The contrast could not have been more stark. The judge in his fine lodgings and the accused in chains awaiting his judgment. And if Sir William had troubled to read the list of felons incarcerated at York Castle awaiting trial, he's unlikely to have given much notice to the name of John Palmer, a man charged with horse stealing. But that was all about to change. '18th century cities were loud, crowded, full of opportunity, but not opportunity for everyone. Francis Drake, not the sailor, the York surgeon, wrote in 1736 that the chief support of York was the resort and residence of country gentlemen and their families. In other words, the rich came here to enjoy themselves, and the city revolved around their pleasure. And where the wealthy gathered, the young followed. York was a magnet for young people. In the countryside, work was seasonal. In the city, there was regular wages. There were theatres, there were pleasure gardens, coffee houses, and shops full of the latest fashions. Now, most ended up in domestic service, living inside the very houses whose luxuries they could never share. But they could come to appreciate. A bell rings. She is summoned. She's flattered, coaxed, seduced. And afterwards, she might receive a new dress, a ribbon, a trinket, a token, a favour something to wear on the public holidays. Everyone knowing how it had been earned. But she was never being invited into society. She would never dance in the assembly rooms. She could wear the fashions of the elite, but she would never be one of them. You could just be desired. You could be desired by the elite, but you could never join them. Secret affairs with servants were tolerated, expected even, but marriage was another matter entirely. A son or daughter of the gentry could sleep with whoever they pleased, but they could only marry wealth. Anything else was unthinkable. And so York's elite needed a stage, somewhere to parade that status, somewhere to display daughters and to reinforce the hierarchy that kept them on top. So they hired the most fashionable architect of the age, Lord Burlington, a Palladian purist, and he designed the assembly rooms as a temple to elegance, power, and the careful choreography of design. But the real drama wasn't in the stones. It was in the people. Inside the rooms of the assembly rooms, reputations rose and fell in a single evening. Upstairs, fortunes changed at the card tables. A gentleman could lose a year's income before the night's candles burned low. Downstairs, dinners glittered with silver and gossip. But the ballroom was the battlefield. This was where the daughters were displayed like assets, gliding under the chandeliers, while mothers watched with the intensity of generals. Every glance mattered. Every dance was a negotiation. Every smile was a calculation. Marriage wasn't about love, it was about alliances. It was about keeping wealth exactly where it belonged. And the gossip didn't stop at the ballroom doors. The assembly rooms in front of us now. Because practically next door, just across the road here, the elegant townhouse owned by Tate Wilkinson, the theatre manager who knew exactly what drew the crowds. He booked the most fashionable courtesans to perform on stage, actors whose reputations filled the theatre with eager gentlemen. And when the curtain fell, those same gentlemen could pay a visit to this house, where actresses received private admirers in discreet comfort. The society women knew of this. They pretended not to, of course, but behind their fans, the whispers flew. Who had been slipping in? Who'd stayed too long? Whose wife was pretending not to notice? And the servants, well, they saw even more. They knew the pattern. When the dancing ended, some gentlemen went next door, and some went somewhere far more secret. Because, of course, when the company a gentleman sought was not female at all, he slipped into an even more hidden world the molly houses, discreet places for men who love men at a time when that simple truth was treated as a crime. The danger was real, the risk enormous, but the desire for companionship, for honesty, for a moment of being seen was stronger. And the servants knew exactly who disappeared into the night, hoping not to be recognised. This was the world beneath the chandeliers, glittering on the surface, riddled with secrets underneath. But step outside these doors and the picture's changed again. Because while the wealthy danced, schemed, flirted and sinned, the entrance was crowded with people they tried not to see. The poor, the desperate, the hungry, beggars pressing forward for coins, hawkers selling trinkets, women selling whatever they had left to sell. The rule was simple: never meet their eyes. That's how you kept your distance. That's how you avoided being pulled into their need, their anger, their hunger. To the elite, this wasn't a crowd, it was a threat, a swarm, a reminder that beneath the city, beneath the silk and the candlelight, was teeming with people who had nothing to lose. And so the wealthy made a decision. York would change. The medieval slums would have to go. The narrow lanes would be swept aside. The city would be rebuilt for them. Wide streets, grand boulevards, elegant promenades, where they could glide past in comfort, far from the grasping hands of the poor. Just take a drink. Plans were drawn up. Merchants dreamed of dressmakers, perfumiers, fancy goods shops lining a fashionable new street. A place for strolling. A place where the rich could finally move through the city without fear. But when the dust settled, the poor moved in first. The grand new boulevard became a gathering place for hawkers, for labourers, street sellers, and the city's drifting underclass. The very space the elite had carved out for themselves was claimed by the people that they feared the most. And once the city opened up, once the narrow medieval lanes gave way to the wide new streets, the wealthy found themselves exposed in a way they hadn't expected. Out here in the open, they weren't gliding through candlelit rooms or sealed inside their sedan chairs. They were visible. They were reachable. They were marks. And the irony wasn't lost on anyone. At the start of the century, the elite had fought against the idea of a police force. Too French, too authoritarian, too much like tyranny. But out here, in the crush of the streets they'd supposedly taken back, all they wanted now was security. They wanted someone to keep the crowds at bay. All they wanted was protection. Because from the moment the city opened up, so did the opportunities for everyone who lived by their wits. As we come into Parliament Street, I want you to imagine this is the busiest of the thoroughfares of the city. A living river of noise, colour, commerce. Street traders filled every inch of space, crying their wares at full volume. Milkmaids with their pails, orange sellers balancing baskets, fishwives shouting prices over the day's catch, piemen weaving through the crowds with their trays strapped to their chests, and above it all, the ballad singers. A good ballad singer could stop the street dead. Crowds gathered instantly. And one contemporary observer described these crowds as a mix of fools, idlers, and pickpockets, perfectly matched to the bawdy songs being belted out. Many of these ballads were about sex. Some were notorious. Ball Away was most infamous, a performance that usually ended with the singer lifting her skirt. And while society ladies embraced the new fashion for lingerie, ballad singers rarely wore any. So the full frontal flash was the finale, and the crowd, mostly men, rewarded it generously. And here's the irony. For one brief moment, the rich man and the poor man were united, leaning in, craning their necks, shuffling closer for a better view. A shared glance, a shared thrill, a shared weakness. And that's where the trouble started. Because as the man pressed forward, eyes fixed on the singer, hands slipped into pockets, a purse string loosened, a handkerchief vanished, a watch chain snapped. And by the time the gentleman realised what happened, the thief was already moving, slipping through the crowd, darting into a side passage, vanishing into the maze of medieval lanes. And then the roar went up, "Stop, thief!" This was the hue and cry, the city's only real form of policing. And by law, every man who heard it had a duty to join the pursuit. So the same men that had just been united by the flash of a naked performer were suddenly united again, rich and poor, apprentice and gentleman, all surging forward together, shouting and baying as they ran. Piss off. And at first, the gentleman who lost his watch felt encouraged. All these men helping him, all this righteous noise, all this energy. But then something strange happened. They began to slow. One by one, they peeled away. Some stopped to catch their breath. Some turned down side alleys. Some simply melted back into the city. And the gentleman realised they weren't helping him at all. If anything, they'd been helping the thief to escape. And now he was alone, deep in the maze of the alleyways. No idea which way to turn. And then he saw him, the man standing at the edge of the passage, still watching, not running, not shouting, just waiting. The look on his face said everything. Go no further. The gentleman freezes, held in place by nothing more than that look. The look that says, turn back, and then the lookout moves. Not fast, not hurried, just a quiet turn into the dark of Peter Lane. The turn of a man who knows this place too well. And for a moment, we follow him. The walls close in. The air cools. Somewhere, a candle is snuffed out. Boot steps soften on the cobbles. He isn't running from danger. He's walking towards it. Word travels fast down here, but not fast enough. He needs to warn the others. A doorway. A woman's hands working through a tangle of silk. She doesn't look up. The shadow on the floor. A boy listening to the tick of a watch. Others lie beside him, waiting for new owners. The figure at a table prizing something. Something stolen. Metal clinks. A scrap falls. Another shape turns pages with the cover torn clean. Anything that can be sold will be sold. Anything it can't will be burned. This is the city's hidden economy. A place where desire's leftovers are turned back into money. Crime doesn't survive on violence alone. It survives on people like this. The ones who buy, hide, move, and make things disappear. And in York, that work runs through places like this. The lookout reaches the back room, a low space lit by a single flame. A man looks up. A lookout gives one nod. Trouble is coming, and the work begins. When we step out of Peter Lane, we step back into the light and a very different kind of appetite. Because if the underworld fed the city with stolen goods, this street fed it with something just as addictive: news. By the 1730s, York's wealthy were bored. They had money, leisure, and long afternoons to fill. And nothing delighted them more than stories of crime, scandal and violence, so long as it happened to other people. Two newspapers sprang up right here in front of us. In High Ousegate, satisfy that hunger, the York Courant and the York Mercury. And like all rivals, they competed by becoming ever more dramatic, ever more alarming, ever more sensational. If the Courant printed a shocking story, the Mercury printed a shocking +1 story. If the Mercury hinted at danger, the Courant screamed it in bold type. Crime sold, fear sold, and the wealthy lapped it up. Reading from the York Courant, Saturday edition, 19th of April 1735. The headline: "The Essex Terrors brought to justice." A most extraordinary blow has been struck against the infamous Gregory gang, whose outrages have long plagued the counties of Essex and Hertfordshire. 3 villains, Wheeler, Field and Saunders, were apprehended last week. Wheeler, seeking mercy, made a full confession of the gang's barbarities. Field and Saunders were found guilty of numerous robberies and sentenced to death. Within days, Rose, Walker and Brazier were also taken. Rose and Walker will hang. Brazier, the gang's receiver of stolen goods, is to be transported. The gang's leader, Samuel Gregory, has likewise been condemned for rape and other heinous offences. Only 2 rogues remain at large: Thomas Bowden and one Richard Turpin, a butcher by trade whose boldness is said to exceed even that of his companion. Surely it can only be a matter of time before Turpin meets his reckoning. God preserve the innocent and confound all rogues. But the Mercury couldn't let the Courant have the last word, so they went further, darker, more moralising. The York Mercury edition, Tuesday edition, 21st of April 1735, headline: "The wretched female thief who defied the law." London has been this week shocked by the execution of Mary Couldn't Come Again, a notorious thief whose wickedness knew no bounds. This abandoned creature made a living by cutting the apron strings of honest women and fleeing with their goods. When at last she was seized by a constable, she behaved monstrously, with monstrous indecency, pulling down her garments and squirting milk into the officer's eyes. At her hearing, she sat upon the magistrate's chair and refused to give any name but her infamous aliases of Mary Cut and Come Again. Though her latest theft amounted to but 4 shillings, a witness identified her as Mary White, previously convicted twice. Her cumulative crimes exceeded 10 shillings, and thus she was sentenced to death under the Black Act. Let her fate be a warning to all who would disturb the peace of this realm. Now, when the rich cast aside yesterday's papers, their appetite already turning to the next thrill, it didn't disappear. It fell into the gutter, where others picked it up. People who could read, people who could explain, people who could be angered, and people that could shape that anger into resistance. Because Mary Couldn't Come Again wasn't a monster. She was an orphan girl living on the streets, stealing to feed a child. And the law, the same law that protected the wealthy, hanged her for 10 shillings worth of petty theft. The bloody code was supposed to terrify the poor into obedience. Instead, it made them question the justice of the system. And among the poor criminals who dared stand up to authority, men like Dick Turpin were becoming folk heroes. Not because they were good men, but because the world that judged them was worse. So while York's newspapers were turning crime into entertainment, Turpin was out on the roads and he was becoming dangerous. After narrowly escaping with his life, he reunited briefly with Thomas Bowden and took up the crime that would define him: highway robbery. Bowden was soon captured and executed for counterfeiting, leaving Turpin alone through 1736, a year of robberies, ambushes, and escapes. Late that year, he found a partner, Tom King, and together they held up the home counties hostage. Quick, clever, ruthless, and adored by the crowds who sang ballads about them. The house in front of us, Cumberland House, the York home of a man who was given the job of hunting down public enemy number one. The Duke of Cumberland organised armed patrols of dragoons to hunt them down, but they failed. The establishment was looking weak. And then, in May 1737, everything changed. An argument over stolen goods, ending with Turpin shooting Tom King dead. Accident or design, no one knows. Turpin fled to Epping Forest, and there on the 4th of May, a forest keeper named Thomas Morris tried to apprehend him. Turpin shot him dead. This wasn't mischief, this was murder. A royal proclamation followed, a reward of £200 for Turpin's capture, and a full pardon for any accomplice who betrayed him. This is significant. It meant that any man charged with any offence could save his neck, could save his life by fingering Dick Turpin. It was time for Turpin to disappear. And that's the end of Richard Turpin. And in his place appeared a new man whose name was John Palmer. John Palmer of York. You just take a sip of my drink. Do you hope you're enjoying this? As we enter Castlegate, which we're going to just do in a moment, I think we're okay. Oh, wait, thank you. Immediately, you're going to see a pub, the Blue Boar. I'm going to hold the memory of this because the Blue Boar is going to come up in our story in just a moment. So, get a mental picture of the Blue Boar, so when I mention the Blue Boar, you'll know what I'm talking about. But we're not part of that story just yet, but here is the Blue Boar. And Castlegate, as you can imagine running down to the castle, is a street of elegant Georgian houses. And it's easy to see why Turpin chose York. For a man on the run, this was perfect. Wealthy, comfortable, and full of people who believe themselves safe behind these thick walls. Fairfax House, we're going to come to in just a moment, one of the finest Georgian townhouses in England, is a monument to that confidence. But getting to these houses, now there was the problem. That is when you needed to use the highways. That is when your body and your wealth were exposed to danger, to the highwaymen. So the rich demanded secure coaches and fast horses, horses quick enough to outrun men like Turpin. And so Turpin reinvented himself as John Palmer, a respectable dealer in fast horses. Horses he claimed that could outrun Turpin himself. So the irony is almost too perfect, because the horses that he sold to protect the wealthy were the very horses that he'd stolen. And for over a year, the scheme worked well. He blended in. He was safe until his temper betrayed him. In October of 1738, in the village of Brough, near York, Turpin, drunk or hungover, shot a rooster dead in the street. A local man, John Robinson, confronted him So Turpin threatened to shoot him too. And Robinson fled to the authorities. They arrested John Palmer, horse dealer. No one realised they'd captured the most wanted man in England. But investigations revealed Palmer was involved in livestock theft. And that was a capital crime. So consequently, he was moved from Beverley House of Correction to York Castle Jail, where he had a rate trial under the watchful eye, of course, of Sir William Chappell. But at this moment in time, nobody knows who he is. In February 1739, Palmer wrote a letter to his brother-in-law, Pompey Rivenel, asking for help and fake character witnesses. He bribes the jailer to post it. Yeah. Now, it's important to note that at this time in history, there was no post offices, or rather, there was no postal delivery at home. You had to go to the postal delivery. But the boy would come and tell you that a letter had arrived in your name. So when Pompey Rivenel was told that a letter had arrived for him, and it was postmarked from York, Rivenel's first thought was, I don't know anybody in York. Or maybe he was suspicious. Maybe he knew it was trouble. Maybe he knew this was actually something to do with his brother-in-law. So Rivenel refused to collect the letter from the post office. And this is where it all gets really rather strange. Because a man visiting the post office by the name of James Smith recognised the handwriting on the envelope. He taught Turpin to read and write, and he recognised his handwriting. It was terrible, but it was a hallmark of a child that he taught, and for some reason he remembered it. So Smith alerted the magistrate, who retrieved the letter. And reading it, Smith was certain it was definitely that of Richard Turpin. And so he was invited to come to York. He was invited to observe John Palmer in his cell. And at this point, of course, the game was up. John Palmer was revealed to be Dick Turpin, the man that had led the chasers across the country, that had made the men of the establishment look foolish and weak, had been trapped in a cell here in York for weeks. And now, of course, the world wanted to know who he was. He was held in a cell, York's County Jail, opened in 1705, and he was there in the cell, held initially as John Palmer, and then of course as Richard Turpin, which meant of course that many wanted to come in and catch a peep. He was tried here, on the site which replaced this court in the 1770s. So this isn't the court that Dick Turpin was tried in, but it's on the site of it. So he was tried here on the site of the present Crown Court, not for murder, not for robbery, but for stealing horses. And of course, under the Black Act, horse theft was a capital crime. This was more than enough to see him hanged. But there'd been a big argument. Should he go on trial in London? This was the biggest criminal celebrity of his day. They wanted a show trial. They wanted to show the people what happens when the dogs bite back. But it was decided that as all the crimes he was charged with had been committed here in Yorkshire, he should stand trial as any other felon. So that is how he came to be on trial here. Now, 7 witnesses testified against him. None testified for him. His defence was that he bought the horses from a man named John Heckington. But this collapsed instantly. The jury didn't retire. They found him guilty at once. the entire trial of the most important, famous criminal of the 18th century lasted less than 4 hours. Sir William Chappell sentenced him to death and then retired to lunch. So news of his capture spread across the country. Everyone wanted to see the most famous villain in England. Turpin struck a deal with the jailer. 10 shillings a visit. He earned enough to buy a fine suit and to hire 5 mourners to pull on his legs during the hanging to speed the strangulation, and later to display his body at the Blue Boar for a shilling a view. So remember the Blue Boar? We saw it a few minutes ago. That's where his body was going to be displayed. And of course, people were going to pay money to view the body. So right to the end, Turpin had his eye on the prize. The money, by the way, that was going to be collected was going to go to his girlfriend. Despite the fact he had a wife and a child, a road to the end, he wasn't going to look after them. He was going to look after his girlfriend. So on the 7th of April, 1739, the tumbrel pulled down the slope that we're now following. Turpin and another horse thief, John Stead, were taken through York on an open wagon, seated on their coffins. Turpin's mourners followed behind him in hats and gloves that he provided. The streets were packed. He handed out flowers. He kissed a woman full on the lips. He drank rum offered by well-wishers. And by the time he reached the Knavesmire on race day, he was certainly almost paralytically drunk. But that didn't stop him. He knew it was showtime. A crowd of 30,000 people had gathered to see the final moment, see the execution of the famous Dick Turpin, the man who defied the authorities, the man they'd sung ballads about. And an eyewitness of the time who covered it for the York Courant, a man called Thomas Kill, wrote for us, Turpin behaved with amazing assurance and bowed to the spectators as he passed. As he mounted the ladder, his right leg trembled, upon which he stamped it down with undaunted courage. Do you want to get the Wetherspoons? I'll see you in there. After speaking nearly half an hour, he gave his speech. He threw himself off the ladder and expired in 5 minutes. His body then hung for half a day and then was displayed at the Blue Boar and was buried the next morning. But Turpin's story didn't end there. They buried him deep, deeper than most, and his hired mourners did everything they could to secure the grave. But it wasn't enough. And before dawn on Tuesday morning, shadows moved in the churchyard. Body snatchers had come for him, hauling his corpse from the earth, planning to sell it to the anatomists. But word travels fast in York. A whisper, a suspicion, a crowd gathering speed. The mob tracked down the thieves to a garden on Leadmill Lane. And when they found Turpin's body, they didn't creep or tiptoe, they seized him. They carried him on the back of a door, covered in straw, almost entirely naked, laying on a rough board, carried at shoulder length, back through the streets on the 4 men's shoulders. A man that had emerged from the people in this final moment was now protected, his body taken, carried in a strange echo of that of Christ. And yet he was the exact opposite. He was everything that we should hate. But in the end, there's a kind of furious triumph to it all. A final procession for a man who'd lived by spectacle, and they took him to the same grave. The grave we're coming up to just a couple of minutes, a place where we're going to finish our tour. But this time, they filled the coffin with slack lime. It was the very last attempt to keep him in the ground, and it worked. But even then, he felt uncertain, as if Turpin, in death as well as life, refused to stay where he was. Let me just take a drink. And so that was the end of Turpin the man. And even with all his notoriety, he'd have been likely forgotten as another violent criminal. But a century later, in 1834, William Harrison Ainsworth published Rockwood, a novel that transformed him into a romantic hero. The overnight ride on Black Bess captured the Victorian imagination, and the legend spiralled. Plays, books, films, TV shows, hit songs by Adam the Ants, if you're of that vintage. Right up to today's tour. But the legend wasn't created to honour Turpin. It was created because the truth was harder to live with. Turpin wasn't noble. He wasn't wronged. He was a product of hunger. The hunger of the poor to survive, and the hunger of the rich to consume stories that made them feel safe. Because in the final reckoning, this story was never really about Turpin. It was about what made him and what makes us. Because in the end, every age must decide which hunger it chooses to feed. And that is the final truth of the Shambles. And here rests the body, the mortal remains of John Palmer, otherwise known as Richard Turpin, the notorious highwayman and horse stealer executed at Tyburn, April the 7th, 1739, and buried in St George's churchyard.